Meeting is now streaming on Facebook. Good morning, Team Humanity. Hello, relatives. This is Joshua Hathaway with my dear brother, fellow King Robert Schwenkler, here to talk a little bit about reclaiming kingship at a time when we are recovering from a model of leadership that has been oppressive, colonial, and destructive to so much of life. And what it means to reclaim our kingship as men and to step into our vulnerable power in a way that honors the fact that the king is the only one in the kingdom who serves everyone and is accountable to everyone. And we each wanted to share a little bit of a declaration about what it means to us. Robert, I'll invite you to share.
Yeah, before we go there, I just want to say that we were going to be joined by Shuja, our collaborator, and at the Brotherhood community. And he's not making it today to join us for this conversation. But he'll be with us in spirit, and we'll forge forward, you and I.
And this is not the last of these transmissions by any means, and I'm so looking forward to what he gets to bring to this conversation.
Yeah.
And as we mentioned the Brotherhood community, I just want to acknowledge that we are in transition to a new identity as an organization, as the Brotherhood community has seen its day, and now it is the Rising Kings movement that is coming into being slowly and organically. And this is one of our first public instantiations of that. So thank you for tuning in, and welcome to the Rising Kings movement, my brothers and sisters.
Yeah. Well, the first thought that comes to mind when you talk about what does king mean is, speak to that in a roundabout way. There's actually a really beautiful mini podcast episode by Jedi Azuma at Rising Man, where he spoke about some of the developmental stages, or one framework for the developmental stages that lead to kingship. And in the transformational world, certain parts of it, at least, this phrase king is just, it's very used, and it's king this and king that. And I think that there's a lot of beauty to that. And at the same time, his podcast episode was really beautiful to me in regards to the just getting really honest with ourselves about where we're actually at, and holding a certain embodiment of a certain energy as our intent, and being really honest with where we're at as well. And that really landed for me as a way of both holding our potential and honesty about who we are and where we're at in this moment. And what you were saying just before you asked me to speak about kingship really lands for me. It's this idea of being responsible to accountable to everybody, and holding a responsibility to serve and lead the people around you. And this could just be your partner, your romantic partner. It could be your organization. It could be any size of group. And it could shift from context to context, how many people you're relating with. But there's a responsibility to provide, a responsibility to create a sense of structure and order in a way that supports the well-being of everybody. And what's required in order to create a structure that supports the well-being of everybody is being tuned into your own truth, but also being available to receive the feedback of the impact that your actions are having from the people around you. And this process of holding this seeming paradox of, how do I fully own what my truth is while fully honoring the truth and experience of other people, is a never-ending and really beautiful journey. And it's the dissociation of those two elements that has caused harm, perpetratorship in the past. It's when the element of the masculine element of this is my truth is not in partnership with taking in and receiving and honoring the truths and experiences of other people. When this one is out of the picture, then we're just left with this is my truth. This is the way that it's going to be. And the structures become rigid, harmful, domineering. And so for me, kingship really is about the integration, the holding of this seeming paradox. And the more that I live life as a human being, the more that I realize that there is paradox is what it's about. Holding paradox is what it's about.
Yes. The dynamic tension between the opposites of the masculine and feminine, in a sense, right? The masculine structure and the feminine flow. Anything that is not in service of life, it becomes brittle and hard and serves only itself and its own power. And that's the model of kingship that we've seen historically, right? This is why we are bruised, is that people in power have continuously betrayed those who they serve and have continued to draw more power to themselves at the cost of life, at the cost of the collective. And we live in an era where there is such massive and incomprehensible inequity, where there are people who have so much power, it is fairly disgusting. And that power is not being used in service of life. Some of it is. And so it's easy to point our fingers outside, but as a king, we have to ask ourselves, how am I hoarding my power? In what ways am I serving myself at the cost of the current of life? And as you said, the king is always asking himself and always aware, what is my impact on the current of life? And this can be a tenuous balance, because if we're constantly sort of like seeking permission and afraid to have an impact on the current of life, then we're in paralysis, right? We play nice, we shrink ourselves and make ourselves small. And that's not at all what the world is needing right now. We have a world that is entering into a state of relative chaos. It's a highly pressurized environment. We have the literal biosphere doing things. Here in California, we're in fires constantly. We have this coronavirus, which has been such an incredible sort of opportunity to reset. It's taken us out of so many of the rhythms of life that we've been accustomed to. And then we have this highly charged political situation here in America, and I know it's happening in other places. So how do we, a realm without a king is a realm in chaos. The king brings harmony. We talk about order, but the higher frequency of order is harmony. Order is an imposed structure. Harmony is a natural balancing of elements. The king's job is to maintain harmony in the kingdom. And he does that through structure. He does that through being a presence. And so my kingdom is my realm. It's everything that I see, in a sense, I am responsible for. If there is something that is not aligned or of peace, if there's some form of violence in my realm that's right here in front of me, then as a king, I don't wait for some other authority who's got some natural or some sort of role of authority to come in and handle that. I utilize my voice. I utilize my presence and attention in nonviolent ways to mitigate and bring peace into situations, right? So we get to ask ourselves again and again, what is my realm? We get to ask ourselves, where is my crown? Do you know where your crown is? We get to ask ourselves, where is my throne? Right? And these are symbolic things that I think are very important. When you know how to keep your seat, when you can stay in your center in the presence of chaos, then you have found your throne, because your throne is underneath you. And sometimes you're sitting on it, and sometimes you're hanging off of it. Sometimes you don't even know where the fuck it is. But my throne is beneath me. And when I remember this, when I remember that at all times I can stand in composure in the presence of whatever arises in front of me, and I can bring a sense of peace and love and justice to what arises, then I am more and more anchored in my throne. So, just a few reflections here. This has been a very powerful theme for me. And the last thing I'll say about kingship in this moment, which is really important, it occurred deeply to me in a meditation I was in this weekend, is that a king does not crown himself. There's no king that forges his own crown and puts it on his own head. A coronation is when a representative of power is greater than the king. And we can, in some cases, that has been God. In some cases, that could be the people who embrace this king. But a representative of a power greater than the king confers the crown upon his head, confers the power and trust of that great force upon the king, and so supports him. And so a king is not this rugged, radical, individual, separate being. A king is only a part of a whole, a very important part of a whole. And nobody ever listens to a true king because they're afraid of what happens if they don't. That's not how kingship works. People listen to a king because they trust him. They follow him because they trust him, because he has gained their trust. He has dominion over no one, because a true king deeply respects the sovereignty of every being in his kingdom, including his own. And when we withhold that power, when we withhold our clarity and our strength, when we withhold that power of presence from the world, when we relinquish responsibility for what's happening in our realm and let somebody else take care of it, then chaos ensues. So we're all being called, every man among us and every woman, to crown her inner king. But we are called, men, to find our throne, to find our crown, and to step ever more deeply into our kingship. Thank you, my love.
There's a topic that's been really alive in my own internal reckoning lately, and that's really alive in the culture as many ways as well, which is this idea of emasculation and what that means and what that looks like and what the impact that has on men and what the impact that has on the world around us. And trying to figure out how I can, there's so deep that I could go into this with all of what I've been thinking around it. But ultimately, in talking about kingship, what we're talking about is a paradigm where, in the context of an individual man, there's a process of taking responsibility for who he is and for what his experience is, while also taking responsibility for who other people are and what their experiences are. And we live in a world, as we've spoken to, where male power and kingship and just male power has been expressed in a way that's been really traumatic for a lot of people, beneficial to some people and very traumatic to many people. And the thing that the piece that I'm such a stand for is the idea that only hurt people hurt. I could qualify that a little bit. I don't want to. Only saying only is taking a little bit far. People make mistakes, and there's a very deep truth that hurt people hurt. And there's an acknowledgement in our culture that I'm very clear about, which is that men who misuse their power in ways that are harmful to other people have been hurt. And there's this place in our culture that it, especially on the kind of left-leaning side of the spectrum, where it can be really easy to point at men and say that you're the one who did this harmful thing and you need to pay for it. You need to figure it out. You need to make amends. You need to get your shit together and actually kind of step out of this harmful mode of kingship, if we use that word in the moment. And
Well, harmful mode of using your power.
yeah, like shadow kingship. Yeah, yeah. And there's a really important acknowledgement in here for me around the humanity of men and the way that men get shaped by our culture to dissociate from their own inner truth, which we've spoken about a little bit. And part of my own inner truth is my empathy and is my sensitivity and is my emotionality. And the stand that I take for men is that there's a path back home for every man. This might be a bit idealistic, and in reality, sometimes just drawing hard lines are required. But the fact is that we live in a world, in a culture that has taught us how to operate in a very patriarchal way. We live in a world that's taught us how to deliver justice in a very patriarchal way. Even those of us who are in the fight for good are so ingrained in delivering justice in a way that's patriarchal that I see so many of us not seeing it. When I think about what the outcome of we want in this world is, it's an actual sense of togetherness and empathy between groups. It's to have bridges being built. It's to have harmony in the kingdom. Harmony comes from understanding. It comes from a mutual sense of respect and empathy. And you made a post to this effect pretty recently on your wall, Joshua, and it's, I'll say it in slightly different words. It's the idea that humanization can never come about through dehumanization. And the dehumanization can be really compelling, to look at a perpetrator of this or that and write them off as really wrong. You spoke also earlier to nonviolent methods, and I think there's a deep conversation around what nonviolent methods actually mean. It does not mean just let things go. I think that force absolutely can be a mode of nonviolent expression. There's the story that you told about the guy getting beat up front of the bar that I would love for you maybe to share in the moment if it feels right, because it's a powerful, a really powerful example of force being used in a loving way, in a nonviolent way.
Yeah. And I think this is perfectly dovetailing with a refinement that I want to make around something I heard you say, which is taking responsibility for someone else's experience. And as a king, I actually take zero responsibility for somebody else's experience and 100% responsibility for my impeccability and my integrity. And if somebody else's experience is one of pain in my presence, and they bring this to me, then I have to deeply look into my own impeccability and integrity, right? If I've caused pain in some way, then I'm being invited not only to attend to that pain that's present and bring loving presence to that pain, but then also attend to my own integrity and see if I have gotten out of alignment somewhere. Because when I take 100% from my impeccability and I make whatever amends, and I clean up whatever messes I make when I'm out of integrity, then I am in an organic process of continuing to learn and be adjusted by life. And one of my principles is one of nonviolence. One of my principles is about doing no harm. And we've been so deeply trained that in order to maintain order, there has to be a violent force that does harm to people who do harm. And so we have this, from my current perspective, utterly ridiculous hypocrisy that we have a state that is saying doing harm is bad, don't do it, or we'll do harm to you. You know?
And I want to just jump in real quickly to even use less subjective language, like ridiculous, it's ineffective. Like,
Yeah,
is X creating the actual outcome
exactly.
that we desire?
Because ultimately, if all we do is prevent a behavior from happening, but we do not address the underlying reason why the behavior was done, then we're just putting band-aids on things, and we have to use violent force and fear and laws and consequences to make sure that people don't do things. If we're not training people deeply and modeling at in every dimension of our society what it is to care for the current of life, what it is to be a radically sovereign, joyfully free and creative being, while also being deeply attuned to our impact on the current of life, then we have to use, if we're not doing that, we have to use laws and punishment and fear and shame in order to get people to behave the way that we need them to behave, right? And
Which, the hard pill to swallow is that happens on, our side very often.
so
It
much.
happens on it happen We see it as happening on their side, but more and
Yeah,
more I see how deeply ingrained we are in this system of operating, that it so happens on our side.
absolutely. No, equivocations on violence are not okay. Just because they did a more violent thing doesn't make it okay for you to do a violent thing, right? Just because they killed somebody doesn't mean that it's okay for you to destroy property that's not yours, take things that aren't yours, or even violently scream at and judge all police or and anything, right? To to be impeccable, to hold a clear line, and to be fully responsible for operating within alignment with the truth. This is what Gandhi called satyagraha. This is la fuerza de la verdad. This is truth force. This is the way of nonviolent direct action, right? We only have true power insofar as we remain aligned with our principles. And I'll tell the story about, this fight. I was in downtown Las Vegas when I was living there doing some consulting work with Zappos. And I left a bar with a friend one night, and it was a big crowd of people out in front of one of the popular spots. And my eye instantly fell on this little thing on the fringe of that group where there were two guys that were harassing a woman and a little bit, and her boyfriend was like, standing up and being and defending her, and the two guys, like, without hesitation, just started jumping this guy. And 120 people out in front of this bar, and there's 20 phones out, and everybody's just kind of watching and like taking in the spectacle of these men beating up this other guy. And I'm like, please stay here. And I walk into the street where the fight had broken out, and I grabbed one of the guys by the collar and threw him off. And then he tried to jump back in and start hitting the guy again. And I grabbed him again and I threw him off. And he jumped up and looked at me. And I'm like, hey, I got no beef with you, but let's keep it a fair fight. There's no reason for two of you guys to be on this guy. If you guys need to work something out, let him work it out. And he's like staggering around, and he's walking towards me. He's like, what's up? What's up? What's up? And I'm like, hey, I got no beef with you, just make it a fair fight. And at some point, he takes a swing at me, and he was really drunk. He was really drunk. I was not drunk. I'm very well trained, and it would have been very easy for me to just put him on the ground. I could have violently stopped this man from aggressing towards me, but I didn't
And
need
the
to.
other guy.
And the other guy, but I didn't need to. That wasn't my business. I wasn't there to do violence. I have a nonviolent commitment, and so that commitment requires me to be a powerful force with as little force as possible, right? With as little force as I need to use. This is the Tai Chi of life. How can you use precisely enough force to get the job done? Because more is unnecessary and less isn't enough, right? And so at one point he takes a swing at me, and I back away, and literally his fist just brushes my nose. And by this time, and I'm still standing here. I'm not like running away. I'm just standing here, right? And by that time, the two other guys had kind of finished their skirmish, and I was like, why don't you go take care of your friend? And he just turned around and left. And the thing is that true protectorship is protecting everybody from doing harm. This is so important, because everybody in a situation where there's some kind of violence, the victim and the perpetrator are both caught in some kind of a pattern, and they're both sort of kicking karma down the road and creating more karma for themselves and each other. And when I am able to prevent harm from being done without doing further harm, that is the spot. That's the impeccability. That's where true protectorship comes from. That is the nature of bringing peace, right? Because beyond protectorship, there's peace, maintaining peace, restoring harmony and order, right? And so, had I stepped outside of my principles and done something that was not aligned with my integrity, then I would walk away with karma to work out. I would walk away with amends to make. I would walk away, even if they did the worst thing, I still have amends to make if I've stepped out of my integrity and done something violent, even if it was calling somebody names, which I didn't even call the guy a name. There's no need. When you are standing in your true power, the arts of violence seem childish, just childish. And that doesn't mean that there aren't times when we have to use the protective use of force, when we have to physically restrain somebody and prevent them from doing further harm. We're actually protecting them as well as their potential victims from that harm. But is the intent to punish them, to make them hurt, and to suffer because they have made others suffer or might make others suffer? Or is the intent to protect them from doing more harm while we take an opportunity to rehabilitate them and to help them see the truth, help them see the truth of the impact of their actions, and to become once again um, an integral part of the current of life? And the core of all of this, it just comes down to this like nut of the illusion of separation. Nobody who has broken the illusion of separation can do harm to another person, because you realize that you're just doing harm to yourself. We are so alienated in this culture. We are so separated. We see racism as a function of alienation. We see sexism as a function of alienation, a sense of separateness, and a sense of feeling threatened by the other. We see environmental degradation. We see the earth as other, and so we can take and we can just do whatever we want to her and get whatever we need.
We see our
When
own bodies as other.
Yes, we see our own bodies as other. We don't listen to our own intuition. We just make our bodies just work and work and work and work and work. Or we, pummel them with different substances to make sure that they don't give us the signals that they were made to give us that something's not right here, right? So this alienation, and the only thing that we are identified with is our mind and our identity, right? And even that we can get alienated from. So when people have a sense of belonging in a whole, when they feel their sense of identity as being held within the arc of a greater whole, the earth, the community, my family, my partnership, my body, then we become naturally devoted to the wellness of the whole. It's not even a sense of responsibility anymore, because that's even a sort of external kind of force. It is devotion. I'm devoted, and I recognize that none of my actions, which are in service of the whole, can spend anything essential of me, and I don't lose by giving. Giving is my nature, right? Serving is my nature. It is the most joyful thing that I can do. There are few things that release more pleasurable endorphins in the human body while sober than the act of giving. And this is very natural, right? So we're breaking a spell right now in a massive way. What is coronavirus but this apotheosis of our sense of separation? But it's also our sense of connectedness, that something that happens in a market in Wuhan can impact my life directly. We are being initiated into the way of our interbeing truly and deeply. And, just as the brotherhood community we're having to let it go. We're having to release this entity that has been of service and that we've passionately served for so long. So all of us are having an opportunity to release a sense of identification with a way of life, with a sense of self, so that we can make room for something even more magnificent, even more integral, even more whole than anything we could have created from that state of energy that we were in before.
And I want to close a loop. I see us both having two kind of like parallel but very distinct conversations here, and related though. I want to close a loop that I brought up earlier that started this whole thread, which is this idea around men perpetrator, which is kind of related to emasculation. I want to use that word. A lot of men, maybe most of the men in our community, the men that we work with that come to our workshops, that come to our weekends, they have experienced a sense of emasculation. They've grown up in a world where male leadership and male dominance are seen and experienced as harmful things, and have been trained and taught in many ways not to be that thing, have made the choices themselves in many ways to not be that thing, and in doing so have swung all the way over to this other side of the spectrum. And it can seem, and there's this same kind of quality of severance is present in the punitive justice culture that we've spoken about as well. It's stop being that thing. Like, you are bad, stop being that thing, or else we're going to punish you. There's no acknowledgement of the deeper humanity of a person, and there's no acknowledgement of, well, what do I want to say? It's like coming back to home is not severing a person from their protector. It's not severing a person from their potency. It's not severing a man from his power, from his sense of power, and from his potency. That either creates the guy who's standing there with his cell phone out, doing nothing at the edge of the circle, watching as two dudes beat up another guy, or that creates a sense of victimhood, sense of powerlessness in this guy that, well, that one right there creates a sense of powerlessness and victimhood. He's not at agency to create effective change and to stabilize the situation around him in a way that's for the benefit of all. Or that sense of victimhood ends up creating a man who needs to act out, who feels so disempowered in his experience that he's got to prove that he's empowered. And this ties back into what you were speaking about, kingship and being kind of provided to somebody. And I think it's not always that this quality of kingship is provided by the people around us. It can be internally sourced. And there's a Margaret Thatcher quote that goes, if being a leader is kind of like being a lady, if you have to say that you're one, you're not. And the same holds absolutely true for this conversation. If I'm needing to walk around and prove my power to other people by non-consensually expressing it toward the people around me, I'm not in my power.
Yeah.
And so we've got these two sides of the spectrum of emasculation and victimhood and disempowerment, and what they both hold in common is a sense of disempowerment. You provide that person a healthy channel of accessing their power and expressing their power and expressing their truth, feeling like they matter in the world, feeling like their voice is important and matters in a straight, clean way, not in some sideways way of expressing violence, not in some sideways way of thinking that they need to give up their voice because otherwise it might cause harm. This is about training a world of men where they're in full contact with their truth, and they know that they're in contact with the kingship inside of them. They embody that. They live it as a truth. They don't need to prove it. And when they live it as a truth and don't need to prove it, they embody these qualities of benevolent benevolence. Yeah, just benevolent kingship, benevolence.
Yes. And that's a path, right? It's a journey from this place of being really bound up and internally twisted and not having access to your potency and power, fearing. And because, you know, we've received all these messages, every child has received the message that your anger is not okay, right? You can't get angry at the god and goddess who tell you it's time to brush your teeth, right? That's You will be violently punished. Many of us were violently punished if we expressed emotion, or especially anger. Anger is
And I want to
actually,
qualify that it's not necessarily physically violent. Violence can mean you lose approval from your parents. That is an extraordinarily painful
yep,
experience.
yep. And so, we all have been trained to some degree to shut down our energetic truth, to shut down the expression of our truth. And in order to gain access to those things again, we can't just like this video is not going to suddenly make you have full access if you hadn't before to all of that material, all of that raw power, the energy of your emotions and the energy that wants to come through your body. It requires a rite of passage. It requires a process of being held through and put through certain ordeals which require you to access and express that energy. And that's exactly what the initiation of the Men's Leadership Intensive is. It's a process of us looking at the shadows that men carry in this world today. And instead of denying the shadows, instead of pretending they're not there, we actually embrace the shadows and look at them and hold them and tend to them in a circle of men. The shadow of our rage, our shadows around sexuality, our shadows around our shame and our grief and our fear. We really embrace those shadows and look at them and reconnect with the vital energy that exists there so that we can more consciously conduct that energy in the world and line it up with our values, line it up with our integrity, line it up with our most beautiful vision of the world that we know in our hearts is possible. And that we are here to create. We're not here to be spectators of that world coming into being. We're here to create it together as agents and as kings. And so we've created this journey as a way for men to get right with their power. Really, if we were to put it simply, it's getting right with your power, but your vulnerable power, not your invulnerable tank power to destroy anything with a bomb, but your power to create, your power to create and to show up and be a force of good in the world in whatever ways you are called, right? Because every king is called to a different path with his different gifts. We're in a time when our gifts are emerging in a very powerful way because of the conditions that are happening. These vehicles of our bodies, these genetic vehicles, are starting to unlock gifts within our very DNA. And it's scary and overwhelming and requires a lot of capacity for high sensation intensity. But it is deeply ordered. It is it is divinely it is divinely ordained that this is happening at this time. And so the invitation that we're making, the concrete call to action is, man, if you're a man listening to this and you recognize that there's a gap between where you are and your full embodiment of your leadership and kingship in your life, then reach out to Robert or myself, whoever you feel more inspired to connect with, and let's talk about what it would look like for you to join this Council of Kings that we are calling together October 1st through the 5th to do powerful work to reclaim our sovereignty.
Thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, we'd love to hear um, what is inspired in you, what is triggered in you by the things we're saying, where we are just full of shit today. Please just let us know what comes up for you in the comments, and we'd love to be in dialogue with you.
Yeah, and I want to say it's like for everything that you or I have spoken during this conversation, I can find an alternate counterpoint that's really important to bring to the conversation, and that is this process of holding paradox. And it's a interesting and beautiful journey to walk, to speak about things, acknowledging that something else is equally as true. And we would love to hear from you what is equally as true that we did not speak to at all or as well or in the right way,
Mm-hmm.
and what you resonated with, like Joshua said. Love to
Yeah.
hear.
What's your journey to kingship looking and feeling like, or queenship? Ladies, I can't speak with any elegance about what's happening on your end of this paradigm of sovereign majesty and interdependence. But I know that the queens are rising, and that really the king is in service of the queen. A true king is in service, is creating safety, creating a space of safety for the queen to, for the feminine, divine feminine to create, because creation is an incredibly vulnerable act. And so as the masculine and feminine come together in majesty, the masculine holds this safe space for the feminine to be in the utter vulnerability of the act of creation. So we cannot do this without each other. There is no one without the other. And I'm so grateful and excited to see what we create together. Thank you for tuning in, family.